Okay, welcome to week 1 of the New Testament survey course. In this lecture, we're going to cover what is the New Testament and how did it get here. And I'm going to show you some pretty cool photographs, I think, and just introduce the New Testament to you. Okay, what is the New Testament? The New Testament is a collection of 26 books and letters written roughly between 55 CE to 150 CE. In it there are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar to each other, and they're called the Synoptic Gospels. And then John is simply called the Johannine literature, or the Gospel of John. There is one history, and that is Acts of the Apostles, which is volume 2 of Luke. And there are 7 undisputably written letters written by Paul. And those are 1st and 2nd, 1st Thessalonians, Philippians, Philemon, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, and Romans. And that list here is roughly in the order in which these letters were written. Now, all these are epistles, and they're basically a letter from Paul to a church, the church at Thessalonica, at Philippi, and at Corinth, and it addresses things that are occasional, like what is going on in the church at that time, and it also gives some moral teachings that are for any reader. And again, that's the same slide. And again, what is the New Testament? There are also 3 letters falsely attributed to Paul. These are called the pastoral letters, written by someone who liked Paul and attributed these letters to Paul. They're 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And they're called pastoral letters because Paul is teaching Timothy and Titus how to be a pastor. There are 3 disputed letters. In other words, these letters here, everyone pretty much agrees that they are not written by Paul. They don't share the same church structure. They don't share the same vocabulary or syntax, and they're nothing like the letters of Paul that came before it. But there are three epistles that are disputed. In other words, some scholars think that Ephesians was written by Paul, and some scholars dispute that. And there is very strong evidence for both sides of the coin. So we're probably not ever going to have scholarly consensus about Ephesians, Colossians, and 2nd Thessalonians. I left out the 2 here. There's one anonymous letter, and that is the letter of Hebrews. A lot of people used to think that Hebrews was written by Paul, but now we're pretty certain that it was written by a different author along the same lines as 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. It just doesn't share the same characteristics as a Pauline letter, but it's definitely ancient and excellent Christian material. And there are 3 letters attributed to John, so there's not just the Gospel according to John. That same John apparently wrote 3 epistles. They're very short. They're 1 page or maybe even a half a page in length in your New Testament. And also the epistles written by Peter, 1st and 2nd Peter, and Jude. And also there's an Apocalypse. And some people think that the Apocalypse was written by John. He also wrote the Gospel of John. But the evidence for that is pretty shaky. Now scholars think that Revelation was written by a different John. Okay, here we have something really cool. Um, this is Papyrus Bodmer 75, and right here you can see the Greek letter E, and then a Y-looking thing, which is a gamma, and it reads out here Evangelion Kata, which is Kata, Lukion. This is the Gospel according to Luke up here, the last 4 lines. And then when we look down here, the same word, Evangelion, and this is Johann. This is the Gospel according to John. And this is what some of the ancient New Testament manuscripts look like. This one was probably written between 200 and 250 CE. And right here is the famous introduction. In the beginning was the Word. This is Logos. And the Word was with God. It's an amazing find. Whenever you learn how to read Greek, you'll be able to read all this. And these are all capital letters. The lowercase letters, manuscripts with the lowercase letters are called minuscules. These are called unicals because they are all written in all uppercase letters. How did it get here? Because of its use in Christian churches, it was an eventual adoption by church councils, and finally, the printing press standardized it. It was a long process to get this New Testament into your hands. It has gone through a 2,000-year process of transmission, copying, and printing, and a lot of it has changed. Scholars used to write in the margins, and some of the writings that they put in the margins actually got included in the text, and vice versa. There's all kinds of textual errors. There's more than 35,000 ancient New Testament manuscripts in Greek, Latin, Syriac, and Coptic, and a few other languages. And scholars had to sift through that and find the best reading, the most authoritative reading, and put all that together for us. And then it's translated. This is Codex Sinaiticus. No, excuse me, Codex Vaticanus. And you can see it has three columns of text, and you read it just like this, left to right, and down the column. This is in Greek, and it was pretty much hidden in the Vatican for a very, very long time. And in the 18th century, there was a Protestant Greek scholar, probably from Oxford, who gained access to it and memorized it and wrote it down in his hotel room every night. And that's how the Protestant world got a hold of the contents of this wonderful codex. It's very authoritative. I think it preserves the Alexandrian tradition of the text, and scholars consult it whenever there is a difference in the texts, and we need to find out what is the most authoritative reading. Okay, a lot of the reading had to do with the two very, very broad backgrounds of Christianity and the New Testament. One of those is Palestinian Judaism, and the other is Hellenism and the Roman Empire. And we start this timeline with Alexander the Great, who everybody has heard of. He had no successor for his empire, so his 4 generals took over and fought against each other, and the ones that survived ruled the empire. Ptolemy ruled Egypt, and Seleucid ruled Syria. Now, the problem for Israel is it's located geographically between these two powers. And they fought continually over hundreds of years for control over everything in between Egypt and Syria. And Palestine was often caught in the middle. Now, there's some elements of Hellenization that you need to know about when you read the New Testament. Whenever these two powers that we saw, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, took over, the Ptolemies were relatively mild rulers over Palestine, but when the Seleucids took over, they imposed Alexander the Great's idea of Hellenization on Palestine, and they basically tried to make Palestine Greek, adopting Greek mythology, Greek worship, and Greek games, and so on and so forth. There was some resistance. The Hasidians, or the pious, they resisted the priests of the temple who were complicit with foreign rule. Now these are the people that held out in Masada and gave their lives whenever Titus destroyed the temple. He had to wage some more war to get rid of these guys. They allowed themselves to be killed rather than fight on the Sabbath. And there was also a gymnasium and racetrack built just outside of Jerusalem. Now, what the Jews did, some of the Jews that wanted to adopt Greek customs, practiced reverse circumcision, which allowed them to compete nude in the races and work out in the gymnasium without drawing attention to themselves. I don't understand that, but that's what happened. The Seleucid ruler, we said earlier, the Seleucids were much more brutal in their rule. Antiochus Epiphanes came to power, the fourth came to power in 175 BCE. Now, what's not in Metzger is some of the brutalities that Antiochus wreaked on the Palestinians. He forbade the ownership of Hebrew Scripture on pain of death. Now, the Torah, or the Hebrew Scripture, was very important during this time, and it being forbidden was very important because it was the Jewish identity. And he went around the countryside, or sent people around the countryside, killing people if they were in possession of it. And he also circumcised babies forcibly. And when I got that backwards, I'm so sorry. He circumcised baby. He hung. Golly, I'm so sorry. He killed circumcised babies and hung them around their mothers' necks to discourage the Jews from practicing circumcision. And in December of 167 BCE, he had a pig sacrificed on the high altar in the temple in Jerusalem. And that is what is called by Daniel the abomination of desolation. Many Jews were Hellenized, and this here is an article, this link, to the article about the reverse circumcision that we referred to earlier. And so they could compete in the games, they could gain citizenship, and they could avoid embarrassment in the gymnasium and in the baths. Jewish priests and rulers were complicit in Hellenization and Greek rule. There were many puppet kings and many puppet religions in this area. Now, the temple was the center of Jewish worship and governance, and the high priests were basically either replaced by the Greeks or they were complicit with the Greeks because of the importance of the temple in Jewish life. And it is from this context, this direct context of the puppet kings, the puppet religions, um, the foreign being conquered by a foreign power, and being forced to adopt cultures of foreign power. That is the direct context of the Old Testament Apocrypha, which are the writings, holy writings that did not make it into the canon or into the Old Testament, and it sets the stage for the New Testament. Now, the New Testament was written a little bit after this period, but it was directly influenced by everything that was going on. There were some revolts, and as we said earlier, Antiochus Epiphanes IV tried to sacrifice, or had a pig sacrificed at the high altar in the temple, and that caused a very bloody revolt that began by some religious purists terrorizing the countryside. Now, they were attacking regular people as well as the invaders. And what they were trying to do was forcibly reverse the process of Hellenization and have the residents of Palestine be pure Jews, uninfluenced by their conquerors. They might have been just as bad as Antiochus Epiphanes IV, the man who had circumcised babies killed and hung around their mothers' necks. They killed the Jews for the opposite reason. But they are seen as great heroes because they did restore the temple and had it rededicated a few years later. And that's where we get Hanukkah. Okay, there were also, that was a rebellion against the Greeks, and the rebellions against the Romans were short and bloody because the Jews pretty much got their butts kicked by the superiority of the Romans. But very much later, there was the first rebellion against Rome was in about 66 CE is when it started, and when Nero died, Vespasian had to go back to Rome to take care of some things, and the Palestinians saw this as a sign from God that God was on their side and he was going to deliver them from the Romans. But Titus came back. The general Titus came, and he laid a 5-month siege to Jerusalem, ending in 70 CE. And it was brutality in the extreme. Josephus preserves the siege of Jerusalem by Titus, and he said whenever the Romans came in, the streets were just up to a man's knees in blood, and the soldiers were trying the sharpness of their blades. You know how you try the sharpness of a blade by cutting a piece of paper, or I always try a sharp blade on my thumb, just scrape the blade to see how sharp it is. Well, the Romans tried their blades on the bodies of dead and dying Jews, and there was pestilence and all kinds of abuse whenever the Romans took over. And there is a column of Titus or Ark of Titus in Rome that displays Titus coming back in victory from Jerusalem. And he brought back these Jews, and they were sold into slavery, and some of them ended up working on the Colosseum. And they also died, of course, in games, and it was just absolutely devastating for the people of Jerusalem and the Jews in general. Now, whenever this happened in CE, Christianity was affected. There were Christians in Jerusalem in 70 CE who fled, and Jesus even said that that the temple will be destroyed and you need to flee. Pray that it's not in winter or that your child. And Christianity was part of the Jews' way of dealing with the temple being destroyed. Now, there's also a Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE. Now, that's when Jerusalem was leveled, basically, by Rome, and they decided to rename the city a Roman name, and they kicked all of the Jews out, and the Jews were not allowed to, they did not return to Jerusalem and have freedom until the 20th century. Okay, the Roman provincial system. We are not going to get into the gory details of this because you could spend an entire semester on it. But you do need to know that the Romans, whenever they conquered the world, they did not have a very good administration policy, but what they cared about was taxes. And also they cared about not developing resistance. They wanted to rule their conquered peoples in such a way that their peoples provided them with income. And you can't do that if all the people are dead or if the land is ruined. So they would often leave veterans in an area, veteran Roman soldiers who helped, maybe even helped conquer that area, and they would be responsible for collecting taxes and sending it to Rome. And part of this is a very complex, this second bullet here, they had a very complex system of offices based on patronage. Now what patronage is whenever you have a friend that is a higher rank than you, who bestows gifts and offices upon you, and you perform that office in such a way as it pleases your patron. It's a reciprocal system. And it's informal, although there were laws in place about patrons, who is the giver, and the client, who is the receiver and reciprocator. And this is how you gain offices and prestige in the Roman world. When your patron advances, you get to advance, and so on and so forth. And this is how they integrated foreigners into the process, and even cities and provinces. Cities and provinces had patrons, and as the patrons gave to the infrastructure of the city or to the coffers of the city could increase in its status. And there were different levels of cities. You had a colony, and then you had a politia, which is actually a city, and a municipality, and so on and so forth. So they had a fairly complex system of status for cities, provinces, and territories. And that comes into play whenever Paul visits a city. It matters whether they were a colony or if they were a free city. It determines, you can tell how wealthy they are just by the designation that they have. Okay, you need to know a little something about the languages in Palestine. The Roman conquerors spoke Latin, so everything that has anything to do with the administration of justice or the administration of taxes or conquering a people is going to be spoken in Latin. And this plays in the New Testament because there are several Latin words that Luke uses to designate, distance or money. Money values are done sometimes in Latin, and you can kind of tell who the intended audience was. And also the Jews spoke Aramaic and Greek. Now, you know that the Greeks tried to Hellenize whenever they were there, and Greek was also adopted by Romans. It was one of the lingua franca of the day. If you could speak Greek, you could communicate with a very wide range of people. And most people did not read, and they spoke more than one language. That's very critical for you to know, because the New Testament is a writing that not many people could read whenever it was first published among the churches. But what would happen is, like other documents, the New Testament was read to an audience, and the audience would memorize it and spread the word to their friends or whoever they happened to be in conversation with. And if their faith came up, or if they were talking about the teachings of Jesus, they would have those teachings memorized instead of carrying a Bible around and reading it. So that's very critical to understand. And the New Testament is written, of course, in Greek. Okay, you need to know something about the cultural and religious background of Palestinian Judaism. First thing you need to know about the Jewish people is the Hebrew scriptures were memorized by boys at a very early age. This was the first stage of a Jewish education. You'd memorize the Torah, which is the first 5 books of our Bible, and this memorization would be the foundation of their faith and their Jewish heritage. And other writings besides the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures were extremely popular. There is no standard Old Testament whenever we're referring to the contexts of the writing of the New Testament. There is no standard Old Testament, like no collection of books that were nice and neat and every synagogue had them. The synagogues had the Torah, and they also had maybe a few writings, and a few prophets, and maybe judges, and their culture in that area would be sort of determined and influenced by which scriptures they had. And the Septuagint did offer a standardization. It was the Greek translation of the New Testament, of the Old Testament and Apocrypha, and it gets its name from the myth that there were 70 scholars that got together, which is LXX. The number 70 is LXX in Roman numerals, and these 70 scholars produced a translation from Hebrew to Greek of the Old Testament writings, and all 70 of them were exactly the same. And so that's where we get the number LXX. Okay, the Hebrew Bible, or our Old Testament, if you're a Protestant, is 39 books written in Hebrew for the most part, and there's also some Aramaic portions. As I said, it was translated into Greek by Hebrew scholars in Alexandria, and it began sometime in the 3rd century and was complete by 132 BCE, which is probably the first time it was referred to by name by an ancient writer. Okay, the Apocrypha, they are sacred writings. They're not included in modern Christian Bibles because in the Reformation, the Protestant scholars decided that the Apocrypha was not as inspired as the rest of the Christian scriptures. So it was included in maybe the middle or the back of some of the earliest Protestant Bibles, but whenever publishers started seeing the cost of printing the Apocrypha, they decided that they would leave it out because the Protestant leadership didn't consider it inspired. Now, one critical thing to note is the Apocrypha, for the most part, is not written in Hebrew. It's written in Greek. and that's why a major reason why it's not included in Jewish scriptures. Now, the most important of these is the Maccabees. There's 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and it tells us the story of how the Jews revolted against Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Now, these are the contents of the Apocrypha. There's 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And we should say the Old Testament Apocrypha, but whenever people talk about the Apocrypha, they're always talking about the Old Testament Apocrypha. The New Testament Apocrypha is almost always referred to as the New Testament Pseudepigrapha, and we will get to that. But that's why I have the Apocrypha. But you do need to know it's related to the Old Testament and not so much the New Testament. There's the Maccabees, written about the Maccabean revolt, which is the first revolt against the Romans. There is Tobit. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. The Maccabean revolt was against the Greeks, against Antiochus Epiphanes. And then there's also Tobit, and that is a wonderful story about the importance of burying the dead. You might have seen in some movies about the ancient times. The one that comes to my mind is Brad Pitt in the movie Troy, whenever Hector tries to negotiate with him before they fight, and he says, we both need to have a proper burial. So whoever wins needs to pledge to bury the loser properly. And the hero, Achilles, will have nothing to do with that. And he's like, you're on your own if I kill you. But the importance of burying good Jews who remain faithful to God despite the Greek influence is what Tobit is about. And it's about burying someone even if the Greeks are watching and will kill you for giving your friend a proper burial. So it's a very good story. And Judith is also a heroine. She sneaks in, and I believe that she kills a king, a Greek king who is fighting against the Jews. The Wisdom of Solomon and Ecclesiasticus are both wisdom literature. And so it's like Proverbs in the Bible and Ecclesiastes. And 2nd Esdras and Enoch are apocalyptic books. And this revolutionized my understanding of the Apocalypse of John in the New Testament. 2nd Esdras and Enoch give us examples of Jewish apocryphal material, and it helps us interpret Revelation. In these apocalyptic books, the prophet is taken on a tour of the next life, or of heaven, and given prophecies about the end times. And these two books deal with the Greek occupation, and the Roman occupation is dealt with in the Apocalypse of John. Okay, the pseudepigrapha. Now, you need to look here at the word pseudepigrapha. It means false, and then pigrapha is writing, or some people say falsely ascribed. Now, these are writings that are attributed to earlier heroes. So, an example that I'll give is from the Pythagorean pseudepigrapha. Now, Theano was the wife of Pythagoras. They lived in the 6th century BCE, and they left no writings that are extant. But in the 2nd century CE, some letters by Theano show up, and they're written in, of course, the style and vocabulary, syntax of 2nd century letters. So we know that it's not by the original Theano, it's falsely ascribed. It's part of the Pythagorean pseudepigrapha. Now there's also a Christian pseudepigrapha. They are writings attributed to Paul, Peter, Mary, and even Jesus sometimes. These include Gospels that are not included in the New Testament, and apocalyptic writings, like other writings like Revelation, and epistles. So basically there are entire New Testaments that are out there which are actually pseudepigrapha. They have nothing to do with the New Testament writings or the people that they are ascribed to. So there are other writings out there. We have the Old Testament Apocrypha, then the New Testament, and the New Testament Christian pseudepigrapha. Okay, the pseudepigrapha contains, now this is the Christian pseudepigrapha. It includes the Assumption of Moses, the Sibylline Oracles, the Psalms of Solomon, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, Book of Jubilees, History of Adam and Eve, the Ascension of Isaiah, the Assumption of Moses. The Sibylline Oracles are again listed, Psalms of Solomon, and so on. It's huge. There are sects, parties, and classes within Palestinian Judaism. Here we will see some familiar characters from the New Testament. When you read the New Testament, you need to know who the Pharisees are. Jesus encounters them a lot. They are of unknown origin, but most people think that they are a descendant of the Hasidians. They first appear with John Hyrcanus in 135 to 105 BC. So you need to know when the Pharisees started out, and it was sometime around the time of John Hyrcanus. Okay, you need to know what they believed. That's what all the stars are about, because this is very, very important. They believed in the foreordination of God and the free will of man. Now this is a paradox, because how could you have free will if God ordains everything? Like, God predestines everything. But, the Pharisees said, within this predestination, man also has free will. How that works, I have no idea. But you need to know that's what they believed. And also, they believed in the immortality of the soul and the resurrection of the body. Now, this isn't so much a paradox, unless your doctrine of the immortality of the soul excludes resurrection. But they believed that that there is a resurrection of the body, which is a reward for good works. Now, this is important because whenever Jesus talks about resurrection, he does have an audience, the Pharisees, who can at least relate to what he's saying, because they believe something very similar. They also believed in angels and demons, and they recognized, this is very important, they recognized that the supreme authority in religion was the Hebrew Scripture, the Old Testament, and oral teachings of their leaders. Now, there are still, that is so important, because there are still denominations of Christians today that some of them say that they believe in Scriptures only as the supreme authority, and like Southern Baptists, and there's some, like Christians, like the Greek Orthodox and the Roman Orthodox Church, that hold to Scripture and church tradition. Or we could say, like the Pharisees, they believed in Scripture and oral teachings of the leaders that aren't written down in the Scriptures. So you need to know the Pharisees came around about 105 BC. They believed in foreordination of God and free will of man. They believed in the immortality of the soul and the resurrection of the body. They believed in angels and demons. And they believed in a hierarchy here, too. It is very complex. They recognized that the supreme authority was the Hebrew Scriptures and the oral teachings of their leaders. Okay, another group that shows up often is the Sadducees. The Sadducees were of the ruling class, and they were influenced by foreign powers. We said earlier that the temple was the center of Jewish worship and the center of the state. And so they were the first group to be assimilated into ruling powers, both the Greeks and the Romans. The Sadducees were a small educated group. They were the sophisticated, wealthy class. The Pharisees, on the other hand, although it does not say it here, were laymen. They were the regular folks who were highly motivated by religion. So they were like deacons or people that are really devoted to their faith, but they're lay people. Oh, I have it up here. Dedicated laymen. So there's a big difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because the Sadducees were the small educated group. They were sophisticated, a wealthy ruling class. Okay, let's get on with their beliefs. And beliefs have lots of stars because it's very, very important. They rejected the oral traditions of the Pharisees. They denied that history was divinely controlled, and they focused on personal freedom. So you can kind of remember the Pharisees and the Sadducees because they believed opposite things. The Sadducees rejected the resurrection of the body and the immortality of the soul, and they also rejected good and evil spirits. Now, one way to remember this is the Sadducees, you could say, were just a little bit snooty. They rejected the idea of good and evil spirits. You know that they're above that. They reject the resurrection, but they focused on the personal freedom. They denied that history was divinely controlled. They did not believe that God was in control of everything that was happening to the Jews. And they, of course, rejected the oral traditions of the Pharisees. Okay, another group, in addition to the Pharisees and Sadducees, is the Essenes. Now, the Essenes do not show up in the New Testament. However, they have beliefs that were very similar to early Christians, or some early Christian groups. So much so that some people think that Jesus was an Essene, and John the Baptist was an Essene. So it's very important to know who the Essenes were. Okay, they did not marry, but they had ritual washings, like baptism, and like Christians, they believed in the coming kingdom. Now, they fled from society. They didn't think that life in Jerusalem with its temple and all of its decadence was useful for them in their spirituality. So they fled to Qumran and established their own community way out there. Now, the community might not have lasted very long because they rejected marriage, but you've heard of something called the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is something that might have been preserved by an Essene community, and I think that's beyond dispute. But some people doubt that. Now, these are the caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. What happened was they were living in basically a fortress in Qumran that Herod the Great had used previously. And whenever the Romans came, the Essenes were not going to fight, but they knew that their writings would be in jeopardy. So they fled outside of the city and they deposited their scrolls into these caves here. And there are a lot of them, a whole lot of writings. And they were found by some Bedouins, who are shepherd boys, who believed that when they threw the rocks inside the cave, they would hear the jars breaking, and they would think there were demons in there. So the Bedouins stayed away from these caves until a very perceptive scholar discovered what was actually going on, and finding these writings, as you know, revolutionized New Testament and Old Testament scholarship. There's also the Herodians. We don't know much about them. They are mentioned in the New Testament as enemies of Jesus, but we just don't know that much about them. They're apparently a pro-Roman group. They were not supporters of the Herods, so we don't really know how they got their name or anything else about them. And you probably don't need to know anything about them for your exams. The Zealots appear in the Bible, in the New Testament. They were the Jews who wanted to fight and die to get the Romans out of Jerusalem. The term zealot was probably given to them as a term of derision, because a lot of Jews accepted Roman rule as a fact of life. But the Zealots wanted to actually fight, and they did not succeed very often. They were just people who talked a lot of talk, but really didn't do anything until a couple of critical battles. But they're not, in other words, a gang of Jews in Jerusalem who go around killing Roman soldiers. They are simply Jews that believe they want to fight and die to get rid of the Romans. They are religiously fueled rebels, and they are the folks that held out for 3 years at the fortress Masada, which was built by Herod the Great. And Masada is amazing. Herod the Great was afraid, even though he was a puppet king of the Romans, he was very much afraid of them, and he built 5 fortresses basically in a line, so he could retreat from fortress to fortress deeper inside of Palestine, or further away from the Romans. And Masada was his crown jewel. It was basically an impenetrable fortress that could hold a lot of soldiers for a very, very long time. They had a stockpile of water, a stockpile of grain, and the Jewish rebels there had absolutely no problem with supplies. But what Titus did, being the conqueror that he is, he had his soldiers build a massive road to breach the wall. And everyone inside had made a pact to kill themselves, and there might have been 1 or 2 survivors. I think that they pulled a woman and a child out of the cistern, and they were able to get the story out of them about what happened. Because what they did was they drew lots, and the men took turns killing their families and each other until they got down to the last man. It's a very moving story, and I've heard that if you were in the Israelite army, they take you to Masada and tell you the story to inspire you to give everything that you have for the state of Israel. And the common folk, they made up most of the people. They are the 99%. Most people in and out and around Palestine were very, very poor, and they lived from hand to mouth. and this includes most of Jesus and most of his disciples, although he did have a tax collector and maybe a successful fisherman, but most people were very, very poor. And you also need to know, and this is very critical, we've mentioned this before, most people could not read. Now that's very important when we're studying a written document. We cannot assume that the poor people were able to read. They had to receive the spoken word. And this is kind of a beautiful thing about Christianity and about education in general. You don't need to read in order to be able to be successful in learning. You need to at least hear the word, hear the spoken word, and often, in the case of Christianity and Judaism, and in the classics, it's meant to be memorized. There are mnemonic devices, there are memory tools embedded in the text that help people remember. But most people in the church, when the church received these writings in the New Testament, most people could not read them. There were scribes and rabbis. Now these people were literate. Scribes usually provided dictation. People would dictate to the scribe. The scribe would write it down. I know from painful experience that most scribes could not write very legibly. The pictures that I showed you earlier are exceptional, but they're very, very difficult to read. They have bad handwriting, in other words, sloppy. And they also provided other services like writing contracts and any other thing that has anything to do with writing. There were schools for scribes, and sometimes a scribe had to have a second job, but if they were a real scribe, you could make a pretty good living working for the government or working for wealthy merchants and other people that needed things written down. It was very expensive, so they made a good living. And as I said earlier, memorization was very, very important in teaching and learning. Okay, the temple. You need to know something about the temple during Jesus' day. The temple during his time was the temple of Herod. Now Herod the Great did a lot of building projects, and he gained favor with that. His temple was one of the great wonders of the world. He had a lot of gold, huge, massive, massive stones, and you can tell around here is the outer wall of the temple, which is, I believe, the only portion of the temple that stands today is going to be this outside wall. But you can see the inner court, and you can see in here is the Holy of Holies, where the abomination of desolation took place on the high altar in here. Now, I want you to watch the YouTube video. It's 5 minutes long, or you start it at 5 minutes. It's about 5 minutes after that, I believe. And you can see a little bit about Herod's temple. Temple worship was awesome whenever Jesus was there. It was a center of worship for the Jewish faith. And Jesus' teachings helped lay a foundation for when the temple was no longer available. And there's a close-up. Now there was also synagogue worship. It was just an infant whenever Jesus was around, but it was probably has its roots in the Jewish exile in Babylon. But after the temple was destroyed in 70, it started out in homes, and then the Jews dedicated buildings for the purpose. In other words, they built synagogues. The early synagogues have no form, which is why it's very difficult for scholars to identify the earliest synagogues. But afterwards, patterns did emerge. Like there were places for the Torah, for example, and where everybody sat. But the earliest ones that were in homes, just like the early Christian churches that were in homes, it's extremely difficult to tell the difference between an ordinary home and a synagogue that met in a home, obviously. But the synagogue really took off whenever the Jews had to worship outside of the temple, and the worship was centered around reading of the Torah and teaching from a rabbi. Okay, now this is my emphasis, my baby. I did my dissertation on the philosophical and religious backgrounds of Greco-Roman paganism that influenced Christianity. Now this is, of course, Metzger's words, and what I did was study how these Greco-Roman philosophies and backgrounds, how we would interpret Paul if we had a philosophical education. And there were 5 very important schools of philosophy, and that's turning upside down. I don't know why. First is Platonism. Everybody, I'm sure, has heard of Plato. It is the most influential school in the history of Christianity. And the reason for that is a lot of Christians wanted to give Christianity some legitimacy. And one of the popular schools of thought in the world for at least the first 300 years of Christianity was Platonism. So Christian apologists tried to justify the teachings of Christianity in such a way that they appealed to someone who liked Plato. Now, there were obviously some significant differences between Christianity and Platonism, but the Christian apologists tried to bridge that gap. Now, Plato lived in between 427 and 347 BCE, and he was a student of the beloved Socrates. Now, Socrates was the old man who went around criticizing everybody and asking the city elders why they were doing the silly things that they were doing. So Socrates was murdered. He was forced to take the hemlock, and he did so willingly. So there's a pattern for the acceptance of what Jesus did and what Socrates did. In other words, if you're a fan of Socrates' life, the life of Christ is going to be very familiar with you. That is, someone who taught the truth and was rejected and crucified, died willingly for that, and his followers are now preaching what he preached. Plato founded the Academy, which was a center of dialectical learning, and dialectical basically means discussion or dialogue. Most of his extant writings are in the form of dialogues. And one thing you need to know about Plato is, if Plato said something profound in one writing, he is going to contradict himself at least once or twice somewhere else, because he's expressing himself in the form of the dialogue. The central doctrine of Platonism is that the true reality is not the transitory object, but the idea or form behind the object. It's Platonic realism, and the point is the eternal nature and not the transitory nature of things. And then we have Epicureanism, and Epicurus decided to hide from us somewhere. Okay, he's up there. Obviously, this is another school. It's Epicureanism, founded by Epicurus, and he founded his school in Athens. He bought a garden and established a sort of hippie commune. It's important to know that in his school they accepted women and slaves. And his education wasn't just for the ruling class, like the Stoics and possibly even Platonism. He is an early atheist, which is very interesting. And he had the Epicurean paradox, which essentially says if God exists, then God is either uncaring or evil. And if God doesn't exist, crap, I forgot it. Anyway, maybe you'll know the Epicurean paradox. His emphasis was on pleasure and happiness, but not on licentiousness. In other words, he did not teach that you should just live according to your pleasure, but according to the more honorable pleasures. He's a humanist. And the importance for Christianity here is that Christianity adopted Epicurus' nature of friendship and community. Early Christians, like Epicureans, accepted women and slaves and children into the community. And there's also that emphasis on Christian happiness and Christian joy. But the part that you need to know is that Christians incorporated Epicurean ideas concerning friendship and openness to women, children, and slaves. Stoicism is another very important school in early Christianity. It was founded by Zeno of Citium in Cyprus, and it's one of the most popular philosophies of its time. And the reason for that is it really addresses the problems of ancient life. They taught that someone who follows Stoicism will be able to face any trouble in life. And believe me, there were a lot of troubles in ancient life. You could be sold into slavery, your city could be conquered, you could lose your home because a new politician is in town or in power. You could be shipwrecked, and you could have a disease that seriously maims you. There were a lot of hardships, but the Stoics taught that if you dig down deep into yourself and live according to the divine principles, which are sort of written on your soul, you will be invincible to all the trials of life. This idea shows up in Paul in Philippians when he says, I know how to abase, I know how to abound, I know how to be well fed, I know how to be hungry. In all things, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. He's claiming the invincibility of the wise person. And he's not following a Stoic pattern. He is trusting in God, and that's how he attains his self-sufficiency. So Stoicism deeply influenced Paul. He used their diatribe style, which is their format of speech to teach, and their morality, and the idea of the wise person. He is not in the world. He's in the world, but not of the world. In other words, a Stoic wise person, or somebody that follows Stoicism, if he's a politician, for example, you can be a Stoic, you can be self-sufficient and invincible, but you are to use this for the good of your city and be involved in civic life. There are schools of philosophy who embrace Stoicism, but think that the self-sufficiency means you withdraw from society. So the Stoic is in the world, but not of the world. They're living according to the divine nature. Now, Cynicism was founded by a guy named Antisthenes, but the really cool part of the history of Cynicism is Diogenes of Sinope. He was sold into slavery to a man who lived in Corinth. And while he was on the auction block, they asked him what his specialty was, and he said, being a master of men. And he pointed to someone in the crowd and said, "That man looks like he needs a master." And that man ended up buying him, and after he recognized his value as a philosopher, he gave Diogenes his freedom. And Diogenes ended up living in a barrel in Corinth. And whenever Corinth was getting prepared for Alexander the Great to come through, everybody was rushing around and trying to get ready. And he made fun of everyone by rolling his barrel around. He's making himself useful by rolling that barrel while everyone else is worried about all the things that you worry about when your city's about to be conquered. He's also known for having sex in public with his philosopher wife Hipparchia. She also embraced the Cynic philosophy. And whenever Alexander the Great came to meet him, he told him that he was standing in his sun. And he told him to get out of his sun. So Diogenes is a perfect example of the cynic, who the cynic means a dog who nips at the heels of men, and he is truly invincible. He embraced self-sufficiency like the Stoics, but he withdraws himself from society. There is a complete separation from the world in cynicism. You neglect society and return to nature. So what Diogenes taught was that you sleep in the baths. That's where it's warm in public. It's a public place that's warm, and you sleep there in the winter, and you sleep in the forum in the summer. And Diogenes also got in trouble for defacing money. He thinks that in order to return to nature, man should be completely natural and have nothing to do with society. And cynics are also known, and this is important for us, they are known as traveling teachers who carry only a staff and a bag. So that's what Jesus said. Whenever you go out, you should only carry a staff. You should only be reliant on yourself and God. And cynicism, obviously, is very important because some scholars think that Jesus was a cynic, and early Christianity adopted a lot of the cynic values. Okay, we've already talked about Epicurus. Pythagoreans is one of the, I guess it's an orphan in the reading because he doesn't devote very much space to it, but it is very important. It's true that it has a tangential impact on Christianity, which means that the Pythagoras school itself wasn't around whenever Christianity was being developed. There was no cross-pollination or influence, except for a very small portion. But there are very important parallels with the history of Pythagoreans and the history of early Christianity. One thing you need to know about Pythagoras was he was the first person to be called a philosopher. He had an amazing memory, and he said that he was reincarnated, and he remembered all of the information that he had learned in his past life, and he got away with that because his memory was so perfect. And there's also golden sayings of Pythagoras. They are riddles that only his followers knew. Now, this is critical because that's a little bit like what happened with Jesus. He will always take his disciples aside and teach them secret sayings that maybe they don't even understand. He talked in parables, which can be similar to the riddles. Another important thing is that he kept his teachings within the family. He did not want to teach in public. And eventually his teachings got passed on from mother to daughter. But if you keep the teachings within the family, eventually the family is going to lose interest or die out. So the original Pythagorean school died out within a couple hundred years of his life, and he lived in the 6th century. But Neo-Pythagoreans, which are new Pythagoreans, were just emerging with Christianity, and they patterned their writings after the Gospels. So if you ever read Iamblichus, his life of the Pythagoreans, or his life of Pythagoras, you are going to notice that it looks an awful lot like the Gospels in the New Testament. And that's no coincidence. Whenever he wrote it, he was using the Gospels as a pattern. Okay, this is the last section. It's the mystery religions. And the mystery religions are characterized by their participation is for initiates only. That is, they don't allow outsiders in. You have to be initiated into the cult in order to learn about it. And the rites are shrouded in secrecy. Nobody knows what was going on. It's a mystery. Nobody knows what's going on with the initiation. And then it's also the mysteries were based on the celebration of a Greek myth. The first mystery that we're going to cover, and the most important one, is Mithras. Mithras and Christianity are closely connected in today's popular culture. You're going to see if people talking about the Jesus mysteries, if you're involved in conversation related to the mystery cults. And basically they argue that Jesus, or early Christianity, is basically the cult of Mithras. And there are there's a laundry list of things that people find parallels, and they say that Christianity is obviously just the cult of Mithras. It's a bunch of unsubstantiated hooey. Many Christian churches, it's true, were built on more ancient Mithraic sites. So that is one of the ironies of history, I think. They don't have anything to do with each other, but Christian churches were often built on top of other holy sites that didn't have anything to do with Christianity. Most people think that Mithras heavily influenced, or some people think, as I said earlier, Mithras heavily influenced Christianity. But this is not based on historical understanding of either Mithras mysteries or Christianity. Now, what about Mithras? They had a very complex initiation period, and this is according to early Christian writers. And they were the ones that had the ceremony of Terabolium, which is the bloodbath. And if you watch there's a series called Rome by HBO, and they actually show this in one of the episodes. A woman goes into the Mithraeum, or the temple, and there's a bull standing above her, and they cut the bull open, and all the blood just splashes down on her. And it's an odd ritual, but it might be thrilling. Who knows? There's also the Isis and Osiris mysteries, which is also very, very important. Osiris, Isis is obviously the goddess, and Osiris was her brother and husband. And Osiris was obliterated by one of his enemies, and he was resurrected by her. And then they had a son named Horus, which is all over the ancient world. Isis with the son Horus, and I have it here at the first as Isis Osiris, but it's actually Horus, their son. Their art looks very much like the Madonna and Child, looks like Mary and Jesus. And it's true that many artists might have used the Isis Horus image to pattern their Mary Christ child paintings and sculptures, but the theology and the teachings between the two, between the mystery cult and Christianity, are basically non-existent. But Osiris rising from the dead is seen as a pattern for the resurrection of Christ. And it was wildly popular, this cult, and the images are everywhere. But the Isis-Osiris cult itself is centered around the Isis-Osiris myth of Isis raising him from the dead. Okay, the Dionysiac cult. Dionysius was the god of wine. It was very important for the study of Christianity because Jesus is seen by some as the new god of wine. Dionysic ecstasy is likened to Christian speaking in tongues and charismatic worship. In other words, being full of the Spirit and being led by the Spirit is seen as a remnant of or influenced by the Dionysiac cult. And they did not have a good reputation with philosophers and even with some cities. They were known for their sexual misconduct and their killing of goats whenever they got into their Dionysiac dance. They would do all kinds of weird stuff. So you had to hide your daughters and your goats from the Dionysiac dancers. And there's the cult of Sybil. This is a very interesting cult that I admit I don't know all that much about, but you do need to know that the nature of ecstatic worship, which is like Christian worship, sometimes got a little bit out of hand, but in the cult of Sybil, people cut their arms, and priests would get into an ecstatic fervor and castrate themselves. So they could only do that once, but that's what they did in the cult of Sybil. It was a celebration of the restoration of Attis by the goddess Sybil. And the Eleusinian Mysteries were also extremely important. It commemorates the marriage of Persephone and Pluto, and it celebrates the Demeter myth, which is when Persephone gets to come up from the underworld and Demeter causes spring to happen. And initiates in this mystery are baptized, and they get sprinkled with the blood of a pig. And that is the last slide. Hope you learned something, and we will see you next week.